Hello, and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Carrie Berger, and I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. For those of you not familiar with the consortium, we are one of 15 fire science exchange networks that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. Part of our mission is to make accessible, regionally relevant information to our stakeholders in Oregon and Washington. We try to offer a diversity of opportunities for people to participate in, and hosting webinars is just one way we accomplish that. To avoid any noise interference today, I have muted your audio, so if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. I'd also like to let you know that I will be recording the webinar today and will archive it on our website and YouTube channel. You can find those web addresses listed in the chat box. Also in the chat box is a link to the final report and other supporting materials, including a practitioner's report that our guests will be referencing today in their presentation. So we have a handful of speakers for you today. First, I'll introduce Antonia Jetter. She's an associate professor in the Department of Engineering and Technology Management at Portland State University. She specializes in improving the efficiency and success of the early stages of new product development and similarly wicked problems through deeper theoretical understanding, better management practices, and improved tools. Lisa Ellsworth is an assistant professor in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Oregon State University. Lisa's research has focused on the synergistic influences of fire and other disturbances on fire behavior, landscape level land cover change, and impacts to wildlife species and associated ecosystems, with a particular focus on long-term temporal scales. Darren Borgas is the Southwest Oregon Program Director for the Nature Conservancy and has worked in the region since 1987. Darren guides the Conservancy's partnership role in design, multi-party monitoring, community engagement, and supporting a cross-boundary all-lands approach. And finally, we have Jenna Volp. She's a fire ecologist with a BLM in the Medford area. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Antonia, and whenever she's ready, let's see here. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you everybody for joining us today. So we are reporting on a project that we've just closed 3 days ago. And of course, we cannot show all results of a long project. We're trying to find some of the highlights, and as Carrie mentioned, we've uploaded several practitioner reports for your reference. And of course, we're always welcome to answer any questions or follow-up ideas. So the topic of my talk is understanding stakeholder perceptions of fire with a technique called fuzzy cognitive modeling. And this is a case study from Ashland, Oregon. And before I start, I'd like to really thank Darren, who's here today, and Jenna for their big support in all of this. So Darren has allowed us to be a participant in the Nature Conservancy project, and we use this project to facilitate stakeholder meetings and to capture information about stakeholders' mental models. And Jenna has, in various roles, observed and participated in the workshop format we have developed and has given us advice on how to improve things. And they are both on the call and will be taking questions. So the research questions of this project were threefold. So the first question was, how different are stakeholders' groups' mental models about right fire? And with right fire, we mean managed natural ignition and prescribed burns. And then, if they are different, do the differences in stakeholder mental models lead to different support for right fire? And finally, do stakeholders who know about the mental models of other stakeholders find it easier to communicate with them? Can they more easily reach consensus? And does it help them to implement right fire? And why we're asking those questions is because we are developing a practical tool for stakeholder engagement and decision support for fire managers. Our study context is the Ashland region in Oregon, which is very leading in the large number of very innovative community and collaborative projects that look into fire management practices. And through the Nature Conservancy, we've been able to tap into this very wide network of stakeholders in that region. This is an example, or this is a map that shows fire risks to communities in the Ashland region. And deep red is bad, as is any dark brown color. And you can almost intuitively see that around many cities in this region, there actually is a compounding of risks from large wildland areas, but also wildfire risks that are really on a very local community scale. So there's a real risk around fire and a real need to restore ecosystems to their former state to reduce the risk of very widespread and devastating wildfires. So because of that, the Nature Conservancy started an initiative called the Bringing Back Fire Initiative, which was a series of facilitated community listening sessions and focus groups that were focused on learning about how people think about fire and on facilitating a series of planning workshops. The idea was to enable the community to collaboratively address barriers and reach agreement. And ultimately, the objective is to create a fire management plan that embraces right fire. We've been able to follow this project by facilitating a total of 7 stakeholder workshops. So we always met with people from one stakeholder group as that stakeholder group, and before we finally had an all-stakeholder workshop. So the first workshop was with the City of Ashland, government and business leadership. The second workshop was with conservationists that are resistant to active management. We then met in a workshop with ODF and BLM in the region. We met with local and private forest and woodland owners, and these are people who are not using lands for timber production, but they simply have larger pieces of woodland where they need to do fuel reductions and do fire management. We met with fire managers from the Forest Service. We had a second workshop with conservationists, and we finally had a 7th workshop where we brought all of the stakeholders of the prior workshops together to an all-hands meeting. The study method we used is called collaborative modeling with fuzzy cognitive maps. And collaborative modeling is basically a system modeling technique that's used to address complex social and environmental problems. And those problems are addressed in a participatory fashion with the idea that individuals and communities need knowledge of the system in order to be able to change it and to have a positive impact on the system. In collaborative modeling, cognitive maps are quite frequently used. And cognitive maps are visualizations of worldviews or mental models that people have. So they're basically pictures, representations of the beliefs, experiences, and knowledge that people use to orient themselves within a given environment. And they consist of concepts and relationships between them, so they're often visualized as ovals or boxes with lines between them or arrows between them. And because they are individual level mental models, they are subjective and they are not necessarily true. They are informed by empirical observation, they are informed by scientific facts, but they are not exclusively shaped by those. And they are very important because this is what people use to make decisions. Here's an example of a cognitive map. So the left-hand side shows a statement by a participant, and that participant thinks about wildland fire risks to structures and people as a result of more and more people moving into the WUI. And the right-hand side translates this statement into a cognitive map. So, for example, the participant thinks that the number of accidental wildfires goes up as a result of more people and buildings on the wildland-urban interface. And that's denoted by a positive arrow from buildings and people to accidental wildfires. Our innovation in this project is that we are using fuzzy cognitive maps. And those fuzzy cognitive maps make cognitive maps computable. So they allow us to simulate the outcomes of changing system elements. So we are basically using a system modeling technique that can use qualitative information, like the participant statement I just showed, and quantitative information. And another advantage is that this is a very open structure that can be easily extended. So if an additional stakeholder in a group meeting has an additional insight, it's easy to integrate that into an already existing model. And because they are very visual, fuzzy cognitive maps are also relatively simple and intuitive. Here's an example of an FCM simulation, and we've done this with a software tool called Mental Modeler that my colleague Stephen Gray, who's also on the call, has developed, and we are also providing links to this software. And with Mental Modeler, we can simulate how the system changes in response to any input change. So let's, for example, assume that more people move into the wildland-urban interface, which is denoted by this little 1 that's highlighted in yellow. And that has the result that the risk of wildfires actually goes up, the big red bar here. The risk to people and structures goes up, and the risk of accidental fires goes up. Having those simulation capabilities now allows us to also test various policies. So in this example, the participant thought that if we teach people more about defensible space, then maybe risks will go down. So we can test this idea. And we test it by increasing people moving to the movie, but also increasing education on defensible space. And in this case, the result is that the risk to people and structure drops from the initial 0.94 that we had on the prior slide to 0.64. So we have a reduction in risks, but the risk of accidental fires still remains the same because in this particular model, there was no connection between those two concepts. So this dynamic analysis allows us to give some much deeper insights into the mental models of stakeholder groups. And we have put together some information on the software and on how to use it, and Carrie has made it available to this group here. Here's an example of a specific map that was developed with the Bureau of Land Management as one of our workshops. So you can see that the actual FCM model in this case is a bit more complex than my sample model. And the findings from this model is that in the BLM mental model, fire is inherently risky, but it does bring benefits to the landscape. BLM also mentioned that they face very specific constraints, like the State of Oregon mandate to extinguish fires during fire season, the Clear Air Act, BLM liability, and various other constraints. In this model, the dynamic analysis shows us that prescribed burns are considered to be more feasible than managed natural ignition. And the model also shows that people are unclear about public acceptance of any active fire management project. So before I continue, I would like to give the word to Jenna to simply share a little bit of participant perspectives on this event.
That's valuable. It looks very complicated, especially when you sort of look at the end mental modeler, fuzzy cognitive map. But going through the process, it seemed like it was a useful tool to unpack some complicated issues. And then, as you shared, you can actually see how sort of tweaking somewhat abstract variables quantitatively can affect the overall problem. So the summary tool at the end was really useful. And it just seemed like a good format to have a productive conversation within stakeholder groups, and then especially at the end when all of the different groups were brought together at the end meeting.
Engaging to, oh, sorry, I think I was still muted. Jenna, could you speak a little bit to how this felt from a participant perspective in terms of, is this more overwhelming or engaging? What is the experience like for someone sitting in a workshop?
Yeah, can you hear me all right? Just to check.
Yes.
Okay. I don't think that it was necessarily overwhelming. It was a little difficult at first to get a handle on how the tool worked, but then intuitively it made sense sitting in the conversational groups.
Okay, thanks. And we'll have an opportunity to pick your brain before the end of this webinar. Thank you.
Okay.
So the reason for doing all of this, of course, is that we wanted to understand how different stakeholder groups' mental models are about wildfire in a particular region, and in this case in Ashland. And the first finding is that there are quite a lot of differences in stakeholder models. So these Venn diagrams show the overlap of mental models for four groups: landowners, forest service, BLM, and governmental leadership. And only the 5 concepts in the very middle of the figure are concepts that are part of every mental model. And not surprisingly, they are prescribed fire and managed natural ignition, which of course was the focus of the study. There also are community and public involvement, ecosystem health, and personal risk and losses. And all other concepts were only shared by some groups, but not by all groups. And that means that the concepts and the maps were not necessarily in conflict with each other, but that every stakeholder group had a very unique perspective on the issue and was paying attention to different aspects of the problem. That becomes even clearer in this model that shows the themes and the unique concepts for each group. So the land owners in the yellow circle, they had a lot of concerns about risks, and they had a lot of discussions about landowner inaction. What does it take for landowners to actually allow fire, beneficial fire on their land? The governmental leadership in the green bubble, they had unique concerns around smoke, about public response, about scientific and technical information, and they raised the issue of climate change impacts of increasing fire. BLM, the blue bubble, looked at unique concepts that are constraints for management, as mentioned, Clean Air Act and other regulations. And the Forest Service, among others, talked about the complexity of management decision to actually implement prescribed fire or managed natural ignition. There were some differences also with regard to the topics people mainly talked about. The conservationists had almost no mention of social and economic factors and were very focused on ecosystem dynamics. The government very concerned about smoke impacts, risk to people, and public acceptance. Landowners, as I already mentioned, fuel treatment and landowner inaction. And the fire managers very much about the complexity of the management decision and constraints around that decision. And as a result, there, of course, were also different ideas about the impacts of bright fire. However, there also were some really important similarities. So somewhat surprising to us, there was very, very widespread agreement on the ecological importance of fire for restoring ecosystems. In the literature, there often is communication about how important it is to let officials know about the positive role of fire, and in this community, that is absolutely understood. There also was great agreement on the importance of public support and community-wide collaboration. So every single one of the stakeholder groups mentioned that, very much this feeling that the community needs to be brought along and needs to agree with any action taken. There was some disagreement on how the stakeholders expect the public to actually respond. And there was very high uncertainty about the actual risks. Risks were mentioned frequently, but there wasn't a clear sense of what really is risky or isn't risky. And so in total, we found 29 different risk concepts in this study, and clustered them along the main themes. So there are risks to ecosystems, risks to the community, risks to the health and well-being of people in various roles, risks to private landowners, particularly liability, and very importantly, a conversation around the risk to decision makers if they engage in active fire management. What happens to their careers if something goes wrong? Are there liabilities? What happens to their organizations if they take actions? Could this result in negative publicity? Could this result in funding cuts? The next question we had is that given this diversity of stakeholder opinions, do those differences matter? Do they lead to different support for right fire? And the answer is very clearly yes. So this figure may be a little bit difficult to read, but it shows 5 different stakeholder groups, and the bar always represents the change as a result of increasing prescribed fire. The first bar is risk exposure, the second is always economic costs, the third is forest resilience, and the fourth one is public concerns. And simply by looking at the direction of the bars, it's quite visible that the different stakeholders have different assumptions about what would happen if we increase prescribed fire. So the city officials in the first box, they see an increase of risk exposure, economic costs, forest resilience, and public concern, whereas, for example, BLM in the box below sees an increase of risk exposure, but a decrease of economic costs, an increase in forest resilience, and a decrease in public concerns and opposition. And we found the same patterns in other analyses, also when we looked at managed natural ignition and other policies. So overall, the city and BLM and ODF see an inherent risk and forest health increase as a result of prescribed burns and managed natural ignition. So there is a bit of a trade-off. If you do what's right for the fire, for the forest, you are increasing risks. They also see managed natural ignition as riskier than prescribed burns. They don't agree on how the public will respond. The city expects pushback because of smoke. BLM and ODF expect a decrease of public concerns as the public becomes more experienced and confident with active fire management. Landowners and Forest Service think that better forest health can be achieved without increasing risks or even while reducing risks. But the Forest Service also considers managed natural ignition to be riskier and less feasible due to the complexity of the management decision. So the third and final question then was if stakeholders who know about the mental models of other stakeholders find it easier to communicate with them. And will this enable them to reach consensus and actually implement right fire in the Ashland region? And to find out about this, we brought all of the stakeholders of the earlier workshops together for an all-stakeholder workshop. And the format of that workshop was that we first presented our findings from the earlier workshops to the stakeholders, and then we assembled them in breakout groups that were completely diverse. So landowners, BLM, Forest Service, city were sitting at one table, and so were all the other breakout groups, all the other tables. And each table got to work with one group-specific fuzzy cognitive map model. So for example, this diverse group would look at the BLM model. And we asked them to first play with the model, try to understand what it means, try to understand the constraints and ideas that are hidden in this model. And then we asked them to actually come up with ideas for solutions to bring more fire into the landscape. And before we did all of this, we wanted to get a sense of kind of the baseline views of the stakeholders on the other stakeholders in the room. So we asked them to assess various organizations with regard to their willingness and ability to bring back fire. So the little colorful bubbles here all represent a different stakeholder group, and they are now mapped into a matrix, and bubbles to the top right-hand corner are groups that are perceived to be very willing to do something about active fire management and also very able. So they have the power, they have the ability to actually do something about the problem. And bubbles to the bottom left corner of this matrix are the exact opposite. So they are unwilling and unable. And so this was how stakeholders assess their fellow stakeholders and their own organizations at the beginning of the workshop. And overall, this is a fairly positive crowd. So they see high levels of willingness and ability. After people had worked with those models for some time and discussed the models in great detail, the picture changed. And the picture actually changed towards lower scores for willingness and ability. And particularly the scores for ability went down. And we interpret this as the stakeholders becoming more aware of the constraints and the problems that other stakeholders have. So other than this very starry-eyed view that everybody will do the right thing, they now engage with the realities on the ground, which means that they also develop a more complex and probably a more realistic picture of the problem at hand. Despite this slightly more negative view on what can be done, the mixed stakeholder groups actually brainstormed a large number of ideas and solutions for improving local conditions. And I won't go into all of the details, but many of those ideas have been described in some way or form in the literature before or are already practiced in other regions. But in this workshop, they were very much localized and they were very much made specific. So for example, community level initiatives, there was really this idea, well, let's always throw a party when a prescribed burn is happening. Let's change the mop-up practice after a prescribed fire so that there is more smoke and fire visible for a longer time, so that people learn that zero fire is not necessary to be safe. And many ideas like that are very specific to the local conditions, but are really potential venues for approaching the problem. There are a few more of those ideas. Big issue also is around liability and personal level risks, and very important to all stakeholders, mentioned literally by every single one, outreach and education. How can you reach the local community to get on board? This study has given us some ideas on what can be done. So we have some managerial implications. A first implication is that we found fuzzy cognitive map collaborative planning to be actually very engaging and an incredibly efficient way to gather stakeholder information from a large group of people. We did a little comparison study with other methods, and we had the same or better concept coverage in a shorter period of time. And we also got dynamic models, and we're able to actually do predictions within the stakeholder mental model. So we think this is really worth exploring further and worth actually doing in practice. Another important managerial implication is that there should be an emphasis on effective risk communication. Risk is really an overarching issue, and it's not exactly clear what makes people feel safe or unsafe in that fire context. So in addition to teaching people about the ecosystem and the importance of fire, more research needs to be done and more activities need to focus on effective risk communication. Another observation was that the fire decision makers really had high levels of uncertainty regarding their risk assessment. So anything that improves certainty around risk is certainly a very beneficial solution. And many respondents actually mentioned that they would want to have better science-based models to be clearer on the risk or processes that make the risk sharing more clear to them. An additional implication is that there is visible confusion about what the public will accept and the public will not accept. And so better communication channels from the general public back to the decision makers will be very important. A lot of the communication and outreach is from the decision makers and the experts to the public, but the opposite direction will also be important. And finally, we did find a lot of conversations around the very limited scale of any of the actions taken. And so people really make that mental trade-off that it potentially entails career risks to engage in active fire management. If the benefit for the landscape, because it's a really small-scale effort, is relatively low in comparison to the perceived personal risk, they're just not so likely to take action. So consider emphasizing larger-scale efforts could really move things forward. And with this, I would like to give it back to Jenna and hear a little bit about how she perceived the results of this larger scale study.
Antonio, if I may just interject a minute. Unfortunately, Darren Borgas is having trouble connecting, so he's emailed me just to talk about the value of the FCM. If that's okay, if I just add his comments in quickly right now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay, great. So he said the FCM, it facilitated thoughtful dialogue within and among groups. People worked hard to see their thoughts made visual and worked well with others to problem solve in the end. He was pleased with the dynamic. He's got a couple of bullets here that we've opened up avenues of communication amongst the groups, community engagement planning, communications planning, upcoming workshops on the wildland fire decision support system, and some likelihood of modeling trade-offs between wildfire smoke, prescribed fire smoke. So that's what he had emailed, and I just wanted to make sure that his voice was heard, even though we can't get him connected today, unfortunately. So I'll get Jenna back online here. Jenna, you're online.
Hi, thanks. I guess just to summarize, again, it was an effective tool to have these really good dialogues, and especially bringing all the stakeholder groups together to gain that common understanding of where everybody has to deal with those risks, and an all-encompassing view of risk that was mentioned, you know, not just looking at wildfire behavior, but risks of liability and risks of inaction, and identifying those shared risk areas. And then one thing I just found really interesting was that there were very different, I guess, perspectives among the stakeholder groups that weren't known before we all went through this process. And it was just a great platform to bring everyone up to the same level of understanding. And there's been a few workshops that various community groups have attended where we've seen some of these results, but really this is the first time that I've seen the full results and report, and I think it will just be a good tool for further developing these discussions amongst all the stakeholder groups.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I think it's time for Q&A, and I'm happy that my collaborators are all on this call, so they will be able to answer questions, as well as Jenna and Darren. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Antonio. That was incredibly interesting, and Jenna for supplementing that. Does anybody have any questions for any of the presenters today? And Antonia, you described that you have some practitioner reports. Can you tell us a little bit about those 2 reports and how we can go ahead and find those reports?
Yes, absolutely. So we, of course, wrote the report for the Joint Fire Science Program, which tends to always be a little bit long and maybe academic. So we tried to kind of boil down the essence of this report, and we created a document that's called Fuzzy Cognitive Maps Modeling for Fire Practitioners, and that really explains the nuts and bolts of applying this method to your own collaborative modeling workshop. And we also have a website called mentalmodeler.org, which has a free software tool, the same tool that we used for this project, for everyone to use. It's a cloud-based tool, so you do not have to install it on your computer. You can just use it on the web in your own modeling workshops. And we have a second website simply called mentalmodeling.org that presents a couple of case studies to give people a feel for how they can use fuzzy cognitive map modeling for their own project. And I think Carrie, you've uploaded the report, and the links to the website are given in the report. We also have a second report that just details the results of the Ashland case study a little bit more than I was able to do in 30 minutes today, and that is also uploaded to the website.
Okay, thank you. We do have a couple of questions, and we have a question here from Stacy. Were there trade-offs discussed between the risk of prescribed fire and the risk of no action that can result in increased frequency and severity of wildfire?
Yeah, so Stephen and Lisa, feel free to join in. Yes, they were discussed, and it's actually something that stakeholders appear to be struggling with quite a lot. So they sometimes try to talk about different landscape scales or short-term risk versus long-term risk. So there is quite a bit of thinking about this, but also unclarity or lack of clarity about the nature of those trade-offs. And so without clear guidance as to, well, how much can I reduce long-term risks, the default seems to be to look at the better-known shorter-term risks of adding fire in the form of prescribed fire or managed natural ignition.
And this is Lisa here. I would just add to that there was additionally some discussion of the differences and the trade-offs between personal risk if I were to put prescribed fire on my own land or on land that I personally was responsible for managing versus kind of a community level risk. And you know, they understand that there is going to be fire there at some point, but rather than take the personal risk, there are perspectives where they're more willing to take that longer-term community-level risk and not put fire on the ground. And in some areas, if they're more concerned about their own property, their own timber dollars, for example.
And actually, if I may still add, there also really, we did a kind of an additional interview study with community members, and there seems to be really a difference in perception depending on what triggers the fire. So whereas the fire managers tended to see the risk of managed natural ignition to be higher than prescribed burns, some members of the public we interviewed were almost on the other side of the fence, feeling, well, if you do prescribed burns, you're kind of messing with nature. And that has to be riskier than if you do managed natural ignition. So clearly there is something very subjective in risk perceptions going on that needs to be better understood to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. You mentioned the need to use effective risk communication methods for managers. Any suggestions or resources to share with managers on how to do this?
So actually, there's very little in the fire world that we could find. But in medical decision making, there is a lot of knowledge on how to communicate risks, because to some extent this is a comparable situation. The patient has to decide, do I take the medication or do I let the disease untreated, and both has risks. And so there is a body of knowledge in related fields how to best do this that doesn't seem to be fully reflected in the fire world as of today. I think one important starting point is to compare the mental models about risks of individuals and groups versus the mental models of actual risk experts, and to understand, well, where are connections, where are concepts where the general public or the stakeholders really assess risk differently from the risk assessments of the experts, and then focus communication on those essential differences.
Okay. Another question. It looks like the exercise resulted in a more pessimistic view of fire-based restoration. Can you please explain if this helps or hinders efforts to work more proactively with fire?
So again, Stephen and Lisa, feel free to join in. I actually don't think it's a more pessimistic view. I think it's a more realistic view. So we often find that in complex systems, people blame others. So they say, okay, we could have fixed this problem if BLM got back together, or the Forest Service, or the communities, or whatever. And that is often because they overestimate what this other stakeholder group can realistically do. And I think what has really happened here is that they have gotten a much more realistic assessment of what everybody's constraints and motivations are. They nevertheless were very willing to brainstorm solutions, and they had a bunch of really good ideas that could work locally. So I think it's really more realistic, not more pessimistic.
Yeah, and this is Stephen. I would definitely agree with that assessment, and I think one of the unfortunate things during the all-hands workshop, when everyone was playing with everybody else's models, there was a great conversation that was happening in the small groups, and unfortunately, because we were really trying to be respectful of everyone's time, we limited it and had to cut it off. But I think that assessment kind of shows what I would assume is kind of so how they were thinking about how willing and able different groups were at the beginning of the workshop and at the end of that workshop. But I think if you were to let them have a conversation a little bit more, they may have been able to negotiate through some of those issues. And so I think we just happened to measure it at a certain point in time. But I think, as Antonia says, it was a more realistic way to view the nature of the problem. And I think if given more time, they probably would have been able to work through some of the barriers that I identified. But I think identifying those barriers is not necessarily pessimistic, but as kind of Antonia said, more realistic.
And Stephen, I just got a message from Darren Borgas, and he agrees with both of you that he said pessimistic equals realistic. So I have another question here from Sarah. It was mentioned further studies may help. Can these be detailed more? Do you have resources for marketing and communication on smoke from controlled burning that you recommend?
I don't. So I don't know, Stephen or Lisa, if you've come across anything. Smoke is a really difficult issue because it's not clear to us after the study what people really care about. So we even had participants talk about the concept of transient smoke versus other types of smoke, and that the acceptance by the public would be different. So if the smoke is from a wildfire from far away, I may be more or less acceptant of it than if it is a local prescribed fire, and that's pretty regardless of the actual scientific air quality. And I'm not aware of any studies that really look into this perception of smoke, but maybe some of the participants on this call have some suggestions.
This is Lisa. I do know that there's some work coming out of the College of Forestry here at Oregon State where they're looking at perceptions of smoke. I know that Christine Olson is one of the leads who's been looking at that and been doing a lot of the social science type work around that to see, what kind of smoke people identify as being something that they're willing to accept versus something that's more fearful. And I know that one of the findings, and I hope that I'm not misspeaking for her, is that people are generally pretty unaccepting of smoke from prescribed fires because they see it as something that's optional and not necessarily something that's needed for the ecology of the ecosystem, but that they are more accepting, interestingly, of wildfires because they see it as something that the community is going to work together to go fight, to go out there and stop the wildfire. They see it as something that's not optional. So there's certainly a lot of work that we need to do with respect to the way that we do the risk communications, the outreach around the issue of smoke. And the ideas that Antonia brought up a little bit earlier about thinking about some of the ways that the medical community has unpacked evaluating risk might be a really good option to look into.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And Darren also chimes in that smoke studies, we want to build public tolerance for the smoke, and studies show support for ecological burning, especially transient smoke. And he says, see Christine Olson, so same answer as Lisa. We have another question here. Hello, thanks for sharing this. I am curious as to if this research pointed towards a specific methodology for transforming mental models following their identification.
No, so this was out of the scope of this particular study, but there is a body of research with researchers called Fishbein and Bostrom, and they for many years have really looked into first assessing mental models and then adjusting risk communications to address the issues in the mental models. And I think this is a really valuable path for exploration in the fire world to really connect this risk communication with mental model analysis.
Okay, any other questions? Well, if not, I want to thank again all our speakers for talking with us today. It was a pleasure to have all you online accessible to us. I also want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen in today. If you have an interesting idea for a webinar, please don't hesitate to get a hold of us. And just to point out again that I do have the reference material and the practitioner's reports posted on the ending slide here. So, and it looks like Lisa has sent a link for information on smoke perceptions. So go ahead and click on that or get that copied down. If there are no other questions, I'm going to say thanks again, everybody, and have a great day. Thank you, Antonia and Jenna, Lisa, Stephen, Darren. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.